October 14th. Dan McMullin is an artist from Seattle. They're artists of the room and queer diaspora. Visions of my living for the 2022 coalition. Their book poems, Coconut One, 2013, Rainbows, Octopus, The Fact, and other early works. Writers Award from the Writers' Law. They co-edited Simone Queer's 2015 book on Little and Press of Alte No. Their art texts influence such Native Art, Metropolitan Museum, Ghana Museum, Museum of Auckland Gallery, Bishop Museum, Clinical Cinema, 2002 Honolulu Rainbow Film Festival Best Short Film Award, 100 Cheese, was the opening of film selection. He presents also Montreal visual selection the East Film all of us arts the speakers in New York and now thank you so much for joining us. Really, I'm so grateful for you to be here and to produce the film exclusively for us. So with that, I'll ask you to take it away.
Thank you, Cliff. I guess there's an audience in the room there, and that's why you were using the mic. I'm not quite sure.
We have a few audience members.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining this Zoom, and thank you for Cliff for asking me to speak today and for inviting me to create a work for the exhibition at the Hicks Gallery. My name's Dan Taulapapa McMullin. I'm an artist from American Samoa, Samoa Society, which is in the South Pacific. It's a U.S. territory. I write poetry, and I am a painter. I put my link up. I don't know exactly how chat works, but I'm at taulapapa.com, and you can link to the book, The Healer's Wound, which is the basis, the artist book, which is the basis of the video I made for the exhibition at the Hicks Gallery. I'm queer. I'm Fa'afafine, which is traditional non-binary identity in Samoan culture, which is a Polynesian culture. And I was invited to present some work at the Hawaii Triennial in 2022 in February. And the curator I worked with, Drew Broderick, who is a Native Hawaiian curator, and Josh Tingan, who's also a Native Hawaiian, the curators I worked with, I worked on a performance piece and some paintings and some sculpture pieces. And they were asking me if I had a project that I was sort of wanting to present that I had been working on previously, and that was this book. I'm working on a novel now, and when I began work on the novel, and it's been going on forever. But I'm actually working on it now, and I've been talking about this novel, I think, all my life. But I'm actually writing it now. But when I began going into the work, I found myself becoming a sort of historian of queer Polynesian culture in my research for the book. And I've always had a strong interest in history, in colonial history. Samoa is an archipelago in the South Pacific. It's, depending on how you look at history, it's sometimes thought to be the origin of the Polynesian people. And it was from Samoa that Polynesians migrated throughout the Pacific Islands over to Tahiti and Aotearoa, or New Zealand. The native name for New Zealand is Aotearoa, and Hawaii. So when as I began doing my research, my main struggle in the beginning was with language. And being both a visual artist and someone who works in language, I really enjoyed this aspect of the work. And and before, when I was younger, I'm 65 now. When I was younger,
I always do.
you had to actually
Okay. I like being Goto.
you had to actually go to locations to access archives. And of course, with the internet, that's all changed. And with Google Translate, one's access to different languages has changed. But I had sort of a knowledge. I spoke Samoan when I was a child. We lived in Europe when I was a child because my father was in the military. We lived in Samoa, and we lived in Europe, and I spoke German as a child, and but was not fluent in either language any longer. As an adult, part of Samoa had been German Samoa, and I was doing some work in Tahiti and French Polynesia, and I've always worked in Hawaii, and so I began just sort of practicing with Duolingo and different language apps, and there are apps where you can read books in French or whatever, and you can click on a word and you can access the word. So I began improving my reading knowledge of Hawaiian as well as Samoan and French and German. And I began looking at texts. And when I put this book together, I learned how to do InDesign because I wanted to do the layout myself. I wanted to have a sort of artistic control over how the text looked. And when I began keeping my own archive of these historical texts about the queer history of Samoa and the Polynesian Islands. I've lived in, Samoa is divided into two countries now. There's the US territory of American Samoa, which is in the east. In Samoan, it's called Samoa Isasae, which means Samoa in the east. And then there's independent Samoa in the west, which used to be called Western Samoa, or Samoa Isasifo, which means Samoa in the west, or Samoa, literally it means Samoa where the sun rises and Samoa where the sun sets. And so when I began looking at these texts, I wanted to find in each example of a text, I wanted to find the earliest version of it. So and you can, with archive.org and the availability of historical texts online, as well as, of course, images, I was able to access the earliest publication of different texts in dictionaries, in translations of the Bible, into different Polynesian languages, in traditional Polynesian chants, in missionary translations of those chants. Sometimes those chants no longer exist in the original language, and they exist in English or French or German. Sometimes the texts have never been translated, and sometimes, and quite often, the translations are sort of not always very good translations, or they're kind of the juice or the sexuality of the text is diluted. And then more often than not, the texts simply don't exist any longer. Originally because the missionaries were very, they censored what they saved. And then over time, as Polynesians were converted to the new religion, from our former polytheistic religions to the new monotheistic religions that the Europeans and American missionaries brought, it was Polynesians themselves, it was we ourselves who began, who just sort of forgot and would no longer save a lot of these queer stories or histories. I mean, that's my interpretation of history. There are two examples that I found where missionaries said that this was their goal. One was Reverend Pratt, who was the main English missionary who ran the missionary school in Samoa, where I'm from, and who in his first Samoan English dictionary did not include any queer words, but in his second dictionary did. And he quoted a line from Shakespeare that said, there are words that we remember in order to know what to hate. And so his reasons for including words like fa'afafine, which means a man who lives as a woman, or fa'atane, which is a woman who lives as a man, or tawatane, who are male warriors who are also lovers. His reason for including them in the second dictionary, Samoan English dictionary, was because he wanted to indicate what we needed to remember to hate. Also, Gray, who was the governor of New Zealand, and he was the main collector of Maori stories. In his collections, he said in his introduction to his collections, and that's one of the main collections of Maori works, the Moteatea, which are the Maori chants. He said that he would only save what was good, what he considered right to save, and that he would not encourage saving materials that were not good, and reflecting on the good qualities of Maori, the Polynesian people. The good qualities, of course, not being queer culture, and just sexuality in general, and cohabitation, or men and women living together who are not married in the church. So this is a very important part of my research. And then another important part was images. And the images, these are my colorizations of black and white images, This is an image that a friend has sent to me that's in the British Museum. The images are not, like many indigenous photographs from the 1800s, are not they're not named. They're anonymous. We don't know this person. We don't know the name of this person. And they certainly don't say, this person was Fa'afafine, this is a man who lived as a woman, or this is a queer person. It was me deciding, looking at this image, that this was a queer person. Otherwise, there's no written history. But this photographer, Davis, who lived in Samoa, his studio burnt down at one time under mysterious circumstances, maybe. But he took a lot of pictures of this one person who was anonymous. And when the missionaries came, in the custom of Samoa, women had short hair and men had long hair. And so the missionaries made the women grow their hair long. So the image of a Polynesian woman with long hair is actually a Christian image. And they made the men, to show their Christianity, cut their hair short. But this is a man with long hair. It's tied up in a top knot. And he has a forelock, which is kind of a youthful symbol. So he has these sort of markers of femininity. This is also an image of a ship, and this image I've looked at for years, but I never noticed until I was putting the book together that the person in the foreground was also, I believe, Fa'afafine. And that's this person on the ship there, standing in the water. And in the old belief, in these warships, it was men only who could be on the ship. So it was kind of curious, why is this person standing in the water? And I think it's because maybe they're Fa'afafine. But also there's a boy there who I think is also Fa'afafine, who's here on the ship. I think this person is also Fa'afafine, just by the way the hair is done. And anyway, so it's that was part of my work. There's a lot of texts that were very homophobic. And as I was putting the book together, I was talking to a friend who's a Hawaiian curator, and she was talking about archival trauma, that notion of archival trauma, which is not something that I, when I was young, the world was much more, the world is homophobic. But when I was young, it was like really in your face homophobic. So the text is not really, to me, it's sort of interesting, the homophobia in text, but sort of my response was, if it was kind of blatantly homophobic, I would put it upside down or sideways. So that was my way of looking at archival trauma. And then I had my own photographs. This is my nephew, who, well, the first time he dragged, he wanted a chaperone, so we dragged together in the Castro. And of course, I was a hot mess. This is that same anonymous figure in the photographs. This is a group of. I'm not very technical, so I don't actually know how to share a screen, and I'm not very. So I'm just putting the book on the screen, but this is kind of my way of doing it. This was a group of Maori women in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's kind of a well-known photograph, which I sort of colorized and tried to pick Victorian women's Victorian clothes colors that were popular at the time. But they were called the Practical Dress Society, and they're on a farm, so I think maybe they owned a wool farm. And What a story of the murder of a Maori transgender person around the turn of the century. And of course, the murderer was let off the hook. This is Carmen Rupe, who is when she was young. She was she actually was the first transgender to enter the New Zealand Parliament. First transgender Takatapui in Maori, first transgender member of Parliament. One of my reasons for going through all Polynesia in this book, and not just Samoa, which is where I'm from, is because of the so little material that survived from the time, so little text that survived from the time. So this is a group of priests who they're not identified. Again, they're not identified in the drawing as Mahu or transgender priests. I'm pretty sure they're from a group of Mahu or transgender priests who called the Alaneo, who were 12 priests who served the healing deity, and the word Mahu, which is the word for Nanese is translated as in the middle, but it, I believe originally meant healer, because the word Mahu, the origin of the word is a wound, and that was kind of the origin of the title, The Healer's Wound. I was referring to, in a way, the wound of time or the wound of colonialism, and but it also refers to this history of queer healers in Hawaii, which in my research, I was trying to find a connection between the Mahu healers of Hawaii and the transgender and queer histories of the rest of Polynesia. But I eventually came to the sort of conclusion that the word Mahu is exclusively a Hawaiian word, although it now applies in Hawaii and Tahiti, I think in the 19th century. This is a group of drag performers. I ended the book in the around the 60s, because it was around the 60s, 70s, 80s that the decolonial movement in Polynesian countries became stronger after World War II, and also tourism became stronger. So there was colonialism had changed and had become a tourist culture, as well as a colonial structures that survived the 19th century. So there are some countries of Polynesian Pacific Islands that had become independent, and then there are some that were had become colonial countries, and there are some that remain territories today, including American Samoa, where I'm from. So when Cliff invited me to do a video work for the exhibition in the Hicks Gallery, as you can see on my website, if you're curious, I have worked in video. When I was in my 20s, I worked in television news in Los Angeles, but I was a film producer and I never touched any equipment. So I don't actually know anything about video. And then I made in the 90s, or no, in the early 2000s, I made a short video called Sinalela with some friends in Samoa. And then I made about 5 years ago, I made a film called 100 Tikis, which I've mostly shown in French-speaking countries, although it's in different languages. But I've shown it a lot in French-speaking countries, and actually there's a couple. There's some people putting together a kind of a monograph of, or a book on my collected works on, or my work on Tiki Kitsch, which was kind of the focus of my work. Like 10 years ago, I was looking at including this work, which is kind of this sort of combination of photography and painting. And that's my hand in a black glove. And but I was mostly looking at, in my film 100 Tikis, which I made in 2016, and there's a link to it on my website at taulapapa.com. If you're curious about it, it's a 43-minute film. But it's similar to this book in the sense that it's kind of a found, it's a found work in that I publish poetry. This is a book of my poems called Coconut Milk, and that's a painting of mine on the cover. It's a collection of my poetry. So I write poetry and I paint, but in these two works, 100 Tikis, this film I made, and in this work, The Healer's Wound, it's all found works. In 100 Tikis, in the film I made, which was commenting on Tiki Kitsch or Tiki bars, and how that influenced film. In that film, I used all clips from different Hollywood movies, but I try to create a story from these clips. So I start off with these different news items about people making kind of fake Pacific Islander sculpture for bars, and film, and then it goes into films. And in the first part, I focus on queer imagery or queer relationships. In the second part, sort of in thirds. So in the beginning, it's about fafine, or queer bodies. And the second part is about fafine, or women. And then and images from Hollywood movies about Polynesian and Pacific Islander women. And then in the third part of the film, it's about tane, or men, and kind of the sort of militarization of the Pacific Islands. American Samoa, where I come from, and Guam, which is Chamorro, or Micronesian, which is in the Northern Pacific. We're in the Southern Pacific, and they're in the Northern Pacific. Those are the two main US territories. Like Puerto Rico is also US territory. It's not a state, but it's sort of quasi-independent country. At least in American Samoa is a little more independence. Guam is very heavily, and Hawaii, like Hawaii, is very heavily militarized. And by that, I mean that a lot of land has been confiscated that belonged to the native people and has been turned into military bases. And for instance, when the dictator of North Korea threatened the US a few years ago, it threatened to bomb Guam. And that's the island that is closest to North Korea. It's in the Northern Pacific, and it's covered with military bases. But the native people are Chamorro. So anyway, American Samoa and Guam, per capita, that means by percentage of population, have the highest military representation in the United States military, more than any state, more than any of the 50 states. The percentage of people who are in the US military are from Guam and American Samoa. Partly the reasons for this is the US is not interested in developing sustainable economies in Guam or in American Samoa. So the only jobs there are is working for the US government or joining the US military. And people do that so they can get a pension. And they'll go overseas and they'll fight in Iraq or wherever, Afghanistan. And then they'll retire and they'll go back to the islands with the American pension. So the militarization, so that was the kind of the focus. And also in New Zealand, the Maoris of New Zealand, they fought in, I can't remember. This is very famous battle, I think, in World War I. But they were, so I include clips of that. And also I look at Lord of the Rings, the original film version of Lord of the Rings, which was shot in New Zealand. And I look at that as a metaphor for, because the director and the screenwriter are Pakeha, or white New Zealanders. And I look at Lord of the Rings as a metaphor for the European takeover of the Polynesian landscape of New Zealand or Aotearoa. Because the only Polynesians in the film are orcs. The person who plays Sauron, the person who plays Uruk-hai in the that battle scene with Aragorn and this big black orc he's fighting. There's Samoan and Maori, and there are actually Polynesian people under all that makeup. And so I look at that sort of hidden metaphor of race and colonialism in what we see as just a very beautiful fantasy film that was shot in New Zealand and is about some sort of mythical English landscape. Although it was written by a man who spent his childhood in South Africa, Tolkien, and was partly raised by Africans in his childhood, in his very early childhood. So he had a relationship with Black bodies. And so I look at, so that was kind of what went into my process of making 100 Tikis, where I, in this one short film I made, Singalela, that I shot with transgender friends in Samoa, I had shot it with some friends, but in this other film I made, 100 Tikis, it was all Hollywood film clips. And I try to make a story from it because there are all these stereotypes of the Polynesian maiden, except it will be played by a blonde European actress. And like there's a great German film about this prince and princess of Hawaii, and they sing all these Hawaiian songs in German, and it's played by this blonde Hawaiian princess. And so I cut from this. She's and they're doing these kind of, they're not Hawaiian dances, they're kind of like fake Native American dancers. They're kind of whooping it up in a kind of a Native American, a German version of a Native American chant. Anyway, so yeah, so that's been a major part of my practice as an artist, is looking at these images and then finding a narrative from that. And that was a major part of this work, which is not looking at Tiki Kitsch, was the object of that film, but was looking at trying to find our history and all this sort of hot mess of fragments of Polynesian chants and mistranslations of Polynesian chants, and so on. I see Cliff coming to the screen, so I wonder if I should go to question and answer. That's kind of my spiel.
Okay, sorry about that. The- I just, since you brought up the book and the video, I wondered if you could talk about the idea of maybe revisionist history and sort of how that plays into your role in looking at archival imagery and text, and sort of, are you kind of applying what you believe, or I'm playing the devil's advocate a little bit here, and
Absolutely.
um, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I would say that these are conversations that we've always had in the Pacific Islander community. You know, like we see these films, and you know, when I talk to Native American friends, I mean, you never see cowboy and Indian movies on TV anymore. Why? Because of course they're extremely racist, and you can't even show them on television anymore. But when I was a kid, we used to watch them all the time, and you know, but now. Now you can't. I mean, what can you do with those films? So I would say revisionist history. Well, I mean, actually, histories of Polynesia are revisionist histories. Any history from American or European point of view is actually a revisionist history. So it's partly, and then we ourselves, as you get into the 20th century, when Polynesians write about our own history, our history had changed so much. And a lot of Polynesian historians in the 20th century would make very homophobic statements in a sort of apology to the church and to Western culture for our past, which was, you know, sort of, and then there's you know, everything's sort of, there's a certain kind of rose-colored glasses viewpoint. You know, I think we all, in European culture, with Oscar Wilde, and when queer cultures began to rise again in Europe, there was a kind of sort of a kind of rosy look at the history of homosexuality and transgenderism in Greek and Roman culture, in the culture of the past. So the Europeans were looking at their own past in order to find a sense of freedom for heterosexual, homosexual, whoever, men, women, non-binary people. We're all looking for a sort of release from a certain kind of, you know, and it was also, you know, with the rise of Marxism and socialism, and there's kind of a rewriting of the history of the rise of republics and democracy, and a move away from monarchies. There was a revision of history, and that revision went to these early democracies, in the early Roman democracy, the early Greek democracies. And it was also, so in a sense, for Polynesians and Pacific Islanders, we look back to our, in many areas in American Samoa, this is still how we control land, how we are able to maintain our land, is through communal land systems and through what we call the whaamatai, which is the family communal land system in Samoa. And very intimately related to the whaamatai, which means the making of chiefs, the matai being the family chiefs. And in Samoa, every family has a chief. It's like current, and even in the political system, they're even though they're democratically elected, they're connected to communal land systems. And that connection to the Fatmatai, or the communal land system, is also connected to our chants. And those chants are also connected to our queer histories and to how Fafine, or queer and transgender people, are integrated into the Fatmatai, into our traditional systems, and how this is reflected in our chants and in our arts, in our dancing. And one of the commodifications, the tourist commodifications of Polynesian dance, like Tahitian dancing, which you may see if you're a tourist in Tahiti, in French Polynesia, or the hula in Hawaii. Part of the commodification of that is that we don't know the story in the dance. And in Polynesia, there's always a story. There's always a chant that is part of the dance. And those chants go all the way back to our origins. And well, I guess I should ask for questions from.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, they're absolutely can unmute themselves and ask, and also maybe.
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's the microphone and the speaker system, but I can't actually. I have trouble understanding you, Cliff. Actually, if you could just talk into the screen without the mic, I could actually hear the question.
Okay. If anyone wants to ask a question, they can unmute themselves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if anyone.
Does anyone have a question?
Hi, Dan. This is Sid. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question. Nice to see you, by the way.
Oh, hi, Sid.
Hi. I really enjoy the treatment of text, or the blocks of text, in the healer's wound.
Thank you.
And as well as the expressive, expressive treatment or placement of the images. And you've described this work as research. And I want to. I'm curious if you may even see it as poetry. Do you see this as a poetic work as well? And I'm asking this because
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I do. It's I mean, at the end, I list the sources, but in the book, I didn't want it. I wanted people to focus on the story I tell in the arrangement of the text. So the citations are not on the page because it's sort of a, but they are at the back of the book. So I didn't. But yeah, I do. Because everything's very selective. I feel like I read just about every commentary on Polynesian queer culture that I could find, especially on the very early cultures, by American and European, and also by Polynesian writers. But I didn't include any of the commentary unless it was first-person commentary, unless it was, there you are, Sid. Unless it's, good to see you. unless it's a first-person commentary. Like one comment I didn't include was actually by Captain Cook, and where he called Kamehameha the Hawaiian King of Clown, because he had all these young male lovers that he was surrounded by, who were kind of his proteges, and they weren't necessarily his lovers, but I think maybe one of them was. And so this offended the whole idea of the aikane, which is the young Hawaiian who enters the hierarchy in Hawaiian and becomes a protege of the ali'i, which is a Hawaiian male or female chief. And they're often the lovers of those chiefs, as well as their assistants and proteges. Yeah, but there's a lot of commentary by Captain Cook, William Cook, who was later killed by the Hawaiians for kidnapping a Hawaiian chief, and by James Cook, Captain James Cook, and Captain William Bligh, who's the same Bligh from Mutiny on the Bounty, who was on Captain Cook's staff, and then later had his own ship, the Bounty, where there was a mutiny. But Bligh was very interested in the transgenders, and he was actually the first one to really write about transgenderism in Hawaii, and he in Tahiti, and he was very, very interested in, and he would make the transgenders he would do strip searches of them, just to see if they were men or women. And he was a very curious fellow, and he wasn't a very nice person. But so in one of his texts, I actually put it backwards, but I always put his text upside down. But they're the only, if I didn't include those texts, then we wouldn't know about those moments. Because it was from that moment that, well, for one thing, the Europeans introduced diseases that decimated all the islands that they visited. So they would go to an island, like they went to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and then they would come back and they said, what happened to all the people? And then they would create a mythology about how the people destroyed themselves. Well, no, 80, 90% of the people died from European diseases. And then the people that were left were kidnapped and sold as slaves. So the entire population that was left in the next generation at Rapa Nui were kidnapped, and they were sold to salt mines in Peru. And now the island's controlled by Chile. And then that was Captain Cook's ship, actually. And those are those are bacteria. Those are the different bacteria that they brought with them. And then there's Captain Bligh's head and Captain Cook's heads in the mix.
Dan, in the video, with the text that becomes transparent, could you talk about that for a minute, or the purpose?
In the video, the video is kind of this long box. It's showing at on a monitor here, and then it's going to be shown in Canada and then in Norway, where it'll be projected on a wall. But it was actually an accident because when I was editing, I just dropped these texts into Premiere Pro, and the first one was this kind of letterbox, and it was this long image, and then I thought, oh, I like that, and then everything conformed to that. And so I scroll the text from various texts from the book and because it's sort of like a letterbox, it's this long aspect ratio, like CinemaScope might be like that. This is like this. So I have the text go through where you just kind of read a few lines at a time. And then I ran it kind of slow. And then some texts, because of the changing backgrounds, I use some public domain images and some of my own video in the background, and then the historical images that I had colorized and kind of wanted to make them feel as present as possible. My partner loves black and white, but I'm not necessarily someone who wants to stay with the black and white image. I kind of like color. So I colorized all the historical images too. And also I felt like things were sort of lost in the black and white images that I wanted to kind of bring out. Partly just the color of people's bodies, and also
So the metaphor. Sorry.
The metaphor of the text sort of being visible or not completely filled in. I was thinking.
yeah, I can't actually understand your. I'm sorry. I heard the word metaphor.
Okay. Sorry.
Sorry, it's gonna make sense.
So the text being transparent. I was looking at that as the historical text being invisible or no longer.
Yeah, I just I kind of, in the book with the kind of mishmash of text, and also in the video with kind of the way text sort of faded in and out, I just kind of kept with that, because I felt if you really wanted to look at the text, you could reference them in the book, or you could email me and I could give you the source. But I remember when I was young, going to the library or an archive, and there was some text that a friend of mine had purloined from this library and archive, and she and I went to the beach, and I just remember pages of it washing away in the ocean. I never forgot that image of how text can disappear. And when I was doing my archival research, which I've done all my life really, but more intensively in the past few years for this book and just for my work in general, and now sort of for the novel, although I feel like in this book, I feel like I found a great deal of what was there. But in the work, I thought, I kept thinking about how history disappears through erasure. And when I was younger, a partner of mine, a former partner of mine who's deceased now, was a theologian, African-American theologian, who taught at Berkeley, and became, I really fell in love with Hafiz and Rumi and these Muslim poets who are Islamic poets who may or may not have been queer, Like Polynesian languages, the language is not gendered as it is in European languages. So I believe so. And so the gender of the lover is not always indicated in the poem. And same thing in Polynesian languages, we don't have he or she, there's sort of a non-gendered pronouns. So, and then with sort of fundamentalism in monotheistic religions, where queerness of cultures was erased or suppressed, I think a lot about erasure when I do my work. I think about ways that I can find a path through that erasure and around that erasure, but I think a lot about that erasure because it's because I live in that erasure. That is part of, it's quite often a part of who we are as Americans. We are a culture, in a way, we're a culture of erasure. For a lot of very complicated and nuanced reasons. But yeah, so I'm very interested in erasure. I'm very interested in speculative realism and kind of the philosophical Kanton Measu, a lot of his work on and how that relates to indigenous and African-American futurisms. That's part of the Malepe, the novel that I'm working on now. It's part of my work there. Is
Does the new sorry, does the new book have a title?
the novel that I'm working on now, it's probably taken me a couple of years to. So right now, I have like a bit of a chapter here, a bit of a chapter there, and I kind of have I have this main character that I Malepe.
Well, keep us posted on that, on the progress.
A work in progress, but I do think of erasure and, as you say, revision and speculative practice is kind of the way I'm finding my way through my practice, which relies on a past that is erased from American history, even though it is very much part of American history, but it's also just a kind of